quick show of hands, how many of you here are chartered accountants? Probably nobody, right? So this is a space that's actually pretty new to me as well, up till about a year and a half ago. But once I've actually started working, right, I realized the amount of pain that a lot of finance teams go through in the country. And I'll probably take you through some of that journey, right, of what some of your finance teams go through and how we're trying to solve this pain for them, right? Just at a headline level, right, there are about 170 business compliances to follow in India, right? It's not that easy. Every business wants to be fully compliant, but it's actually an extremely difficult task for most of you, right? And if I step back, maybe a few years ago, you had your, let's say your business and then your compliance. There were two isolated concepts. Maybe compliance was once, let's say once in a quarter or once a while, right? Every state had its own thing going on. There's a lot of paperwork involved. You just needed, let's say your data and your auditor to be compliant. And your supply chain and business was separate, right? You didn't really need to care about the compliance risk, let's say of your vendors or customers, dealers, distributors, etc., right? But what has happened is since 2017, that has completely changed. What the government has started to do is, this is more so of digitization as well as think of as a revenue optimization that they've started to do, right? For government's revenue essentially, right? And what's government's revenue? It's taxes, right? So to cut down on tax avoidance, there've been a whole lot of digital initiatives from the government side. What this has led to, I mean, starting in 2017 with GST, for instance, followed by e-way bills, e-invoices, input tax credits being restricted, etc., right? What this led to is your compliance and your business are now fairly merged together, right? You cannot think of compliance as something, let's say if you are, it's no longer just a finance team's concern. It's now also becoming a CXO and a business team's concern, right? You need to care about who you're doing business with. Let's say it be your vendors, dealers, distributors, all of them, right? And even the tax laws, for instance, right, they keep on changing. GST has been introduced maybe in 2017. It's been what, 4 or 5 years now, and it's still not fully stabilized, right? The government is also becoming a lot more stringent day after day. There are things like, for instance, the fourth screenshot on the right, that's something I found interesting. There's already something called as fast tax system, and there's e-way bill system, right? Now the government can actually track to see whether was your e-way bill valid when your goods left a particular state border and everything, right? So it's actually becoming, the government has a lot of data. If you think about it, right, across your, let's say your GST returns, your direct tax returns, across so many other pieces, there's a lot of data that the government actually has about you. In fact, they can create a shadow PNL and they can actually track you on a hour by hour basis of exactly what you're doing, right? So they have not fully, for instance, each of the data exists in silos, but there's an intent to sort of merge together and strengthen the digital surveillance from their side, right? And this is something that's where India is actually ahead of some of the other countries in the world in terms of leveraging technology for compliance, right? And this is one place where the government is actually ahead of India Inc. The government is actually ahead of most of the corporate world, right? Most of you are, I can guarantee you, most of your finance teams are 2 steps behind the government in terms of digitization, right? So because of this, there's almost a compliance-led digitization wave that's happening in the country, which most of you are probably not aware about, right? Your finance teams are probably aware about it. They're probably spending, late nights or weekends just around the government deadlines. They're sort of managing it. But this is the extent of technology adoption on the government side is only going to increase. And if your finance teams don't adopt technology ahead of the curve, it's going to hit you like an ocean, right? Like a tsunami. Because the way they're sort of solving this problem is they're trying to manage it, right? With people, with Excels, with sort of ad hoc ERP solutions, maybe outsourcing it to your tax consultant, etc., right? That's not a long-term sustainable solution. And you will probably not realize this until it's too late, right? Until there are some government notices that you get, or some registrations of yours are shut down and hence you cannot do business anymore. or let's say 2 degrees of freedom away, right? Let's say your dealers or distributors or some of the other partners that you have or your vendors, their registrations are shut down, etc. Right? So it's a high risk game, and it's unfortunately a problem of low visibility as well with most CXOs in India. I'll go deeper in this, right? It's not just about compliance risk, there's also a lot of value that gets lost. And I'm again sure most of you would not know that your companies are probably losing a lot of money because of, let's say, poor tax optimization, right? I'm sure a lot of you try to optimize your personal taxes, and at a company level, maybe you do things like, let's say, procurement optimization or headcount optimization, etc. But none of you are probably doing a tax optimization. In your P&L, there's a tax line item. You just leave it at that, right? You don't try to deep dive and see whether you actually optimize those taxes, right? And trust me, there is a lot of value that actually goes in over there, right? And the reason people don't do this is because they're barely even able to find time to just comply with the law, finish filing on time, etc. Right? This is 2-3 steps ahead of that, right? Is there an opportunity to save taxes and do this in real time? Because some of these compliances are now real time. Every time you issue an invoice, you have to report it to the government, right? If it's in a B2B invoice, it has to be reported in the form of an invoice in real time, right? So some of these are probably not possible through, let's say, ad hoc solutions or managed services, or throwing people at this problem, etc. Right? And beyond compliance, as I mentioned, think forward and backward, right? Forward for supply chain means your customers, dealers, distributors, and your backward supply chain means your vendors and the AP part of the chain, right? Because compliance is now a network game, right? You cannot be compliant standalone. Your forward chain as well as your backward chain has to be compliant, and only then you can do this. Because of this, right, even your usual BAU business, right, that you would probably operate with your partners has become a lot more painful. If it is not painful, then you're probably not doing the right things, right? If you're trying to be ahead of the curve, it is extremely painful. Whether it be, let's say, your vendor sending you invoices, do you know it is valid, not valid, etc. Right? Every customer you onboard, every dealer or distributor, new business that you onboard, do you know their compliance history? You probably don't. So there are a lot of such pain points that actually exist and probably not fully surfaced to a lot of you. Right? And for instance, and this is a slide, for instance, you should take to your CFO, right? This is what's in your CFO's purview. Let's say it's planning and budgeting, compliance, payments, transacting with your vendors, and probably the base is probably like the record keeping and etc. Right? And there are probably 2 classes of partners and players that they are probably trying to leverage. One is, if you're a large business, it will most likely be one of the big audit firms, right? Like the likes of PwC, EY, etc. If you're a smaller firm, it'd be your local tax consultant. The other is your ERP. And that is it, right? Those are the only 2 things your CFO probably leverages to help you manage your business. And these 2 classes of players are not sufficient, right? Starting with, let's say, your audit firms or your local tax consultants, tech is not in their DNA, and fundamentally this is a tech problem to solve, right? And hence they're in, like, let's say, 2 layers of the stack. They're not like a full stack finance player, for instance, right? They also, for instance, probably only try to serve your tax needs. They don't even believe in, let's say, getting your vendors onto the same platform, getting your account payable, AR team, etc. onto the same platform, right? They're probably providing singular narrow service, which is, let's say, your compliance and audit. Your ERP, for instance, most likely you would be using either SAP or Oracle, etc., right? Or maybe you're using Tally if you're smaller. Some of these global ERP players, they do not care about India, right? I mean, India accounts for less than 5% of their revenue. And most of these are India-specific technology problems, and hence, even if they did, it would take maybe like a few months to a few years sometimes to implement like an ERP solution, right? And the government doesn't wait that long. They will, for instance, wake up tomorrow and say, let's say 1st of December, this is the law. You have to follow it. Whether you're able to implement it in your ERP or not, I don't care. You'll have to implement it. Right? So it's super fast moving, and your ERPs cannot catch up with this, right? So that's the problem statement. How do you start, right, in this insanely complicated sort of an environment where you have very little leverage? How do you start, right? So, and this is a question I ask to a lot of CFOs that I speak to. If there is a genie and they asked you 3 wishes, what would you ask for? And these are the 3 most common answers I get, right? The first is digital everything, right? It's not just, and digital everything doesn't just mean what I do on paper has to be on like some tech system. I want everything to happen at the click of a button, right? Second is automation everywhere. There's so many different data sources. You have your data on your ERP, for instance. There's also some data on the with the indirect tax government, with the direct tax, with some data that your vendors have, some data that your dealers, distributors have. None of these match, right? There's an insane amount of confusion about what is the single source of truth. Everything has to be automated and matches in a real time, right? So this is the most common sort of wishes that I've heard. And this is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? We're trying to sort of create like the digital transformation for the finance teams in India. In Indian context, there's no one who's actually trying to solve this ahead of the curve. And that's where we come in against some of the alternatives, which is, let's say, ad hoc government tools, or let's say some sort of audit firms or Excel, ERP solutions, etc. We're trying to solve this through SaaS. SaaS, that is cloud native and AI first, right? And there's a lot of depth I could go into. I think we're running out of time. So I'll move a bit forward, right? We're trying to solve this not only as a SaaS to individual enterprises, but SaaS for the entire network. Imagine sort of like a social network for businesses, right? So you have which is like your clear enterprise of sort, right? You also have your vendors, your distributors, and let's say your accountants on the same platform. Everybody is super connected. And not only are they connected on the SaaS, or each of these players are also integrated with their ERP, right? Your clear products for your enterprise is deeply integrated with your ERP instead of creating a random source of truth separately, right? And each of the other players are also integrated with their source of truth, where let's say it could be Tally, let's say, for your vendors, etc., right? And that's how we are thinking about it. If I go, let's say, few years ahead, right? And this is a point of view that we have compiled looking at a few countries which are probably ahead of the curve on, let's say, specific use cases, right? So the first is, because the government is already forcing this digitization on the endpoint, right? There's a compliance-led digitization that will happen throughout the entire finance process. There is going to be automation everywhere in your business processes, finance processes, whether you like it or not, right? There is also thought for having an AI-based surveillance. As I mentioned, right, the amount of data that the government has about you is insane. Imagine if the government leverages AI to monitor you. There's zero scope for errors, right? There's zero scope for non-compliance or mismatches or gaps or anything like that. And there's a lot of discussion about, for instance, a lot of data that the B2C tech companies have about us, right? Like, let's say the let's say the Facebook or Google, etc., right? There's even more of a data that the government has about you, because there you can at least opt in. Here, if you want to do business in India, you have to report things to the government, right? So with the amount of data and AI on top of that data and all of these interconnected departments, for instance, it's going to be insane. You cannot be ahead of the curve without leveraging technology, right? I'll also talk about the last piece, because there's been a lot of discussion about credit in the last few panel discussions. The other piece is technology-led credit and invoice discounting, right? And we've seen this in many other countries where e-invoicing came in. After e-invoicing comes in, by default in 2 to 3 years, invoice discounting becomes the norm. Invoice discounting is, for instance, something called as, let's say, early payment programs, right? For your vendors, I'll pay you right now instead of paying you after 60 days. Give me a discount. Essentially, you are transferring working capital without really calling it a loan, right? So something like that, that becomes sort of a norm. And this is something that again, a lot of enterprise in India are not actively thinking about. Yeah. This is an interesting pictographic, right? What a lot of people do is on the left. Most likely your finance teams are doing what's on the left. They try to throw people at this problem. They'll not be able to solve it. They'll outsource it, most likely to people in some big accounting firms. They'll still not be able to solve it. Then they'll bring in technology. The right hand side is what most smarter people do, which is cut short all of that bullshit and then get technology from the day zero, right? We're already at scale. For instance, we already have 3,500 enterprises. That's like 1 in 5, 6 enterprises in India already are on ClearTax. Most of your companies are probably on it, but you will probably not know it because it's a finance specific pain point, right? And again, we are in this space, there's actually not enough of a parallel that we have. Our products are industry leading, first in class. If this is something that you want to know, please reach out to me. Yeah. Thank you.